Ethan woke to the cold, harsh reality of his new existence. His body ached from the violent crash that had brought him here. His mind scrambled with disorientation. As he struggled to focus on his surroundings, his hands were bound by thick metal chains that dug into his skin. The harsh red glow of alien technology flickering around him in an unsettling pattern. The air smelled metallic and sharp, a stark contrast to the earthy scent of his home planet Earth. His eyes adjusted to the dimly lit room as his ears caught the low hum of machinery outside his cell. The alien ship was unlike anything he had seen before. Its sleek design, combined with strange symbols and mechanical hums, filled him with an odd sense of dread and curiosity. As he tried to make sense of his situation, he realized his communication devices had been taken and any chance of sending a distress signal was now gone. He had no idea where he was or what kind of beings had captured him. All he could do was wait. He heard footsteps approaching the door of his cell, the noise echoing in the quiet of his prison. Soon the door opened with a hiss, revealing two towering figures who seemed to glide, rather than walk, their bodies, a blend of organic and synthetic elements. Sharp, angular features framed their faces, their eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. But it wasn't their appearance that shocked Ethan, it was their language. They spoke in a low hum that was simultaneously melodic and menacing. Their words flowed like liquid silver around him, as if the very sound of their speech was alien and foreign. But there was something about it that tugged at the back of Ethan's mind, something familiar, a language he had never heard, but somehow understood. As the alien words passed his ears, a sudden flash of recognition struck him in the depths of his mind. He knew what they were saying. The first aliens spoke with authority and strength, their voice commanding the space as it echoed through the walls. The second followed with words of warning and displeasure, but to Ethan's surprise, he understood every syllable. A surge of panic swept through him as he realized that not only was he able to comprehend the alien language, but he could understand its subtleties, the tone, the hidden meanings. Everything was clear to him, as if the universe itself had granted him a strange gift in the moments of his captivity. It didn't make sense how he could understand the language or why it felt so natural to him, but he didn't have time to question it. He needed to focus on the situation at hand. The aliens seemed to be discussing his fate, their words flowing rapidly, with no regard for his understanding. The first alien gestured toward him, pointing to his chains, and then to their strange communicator devices. Their movements were precise, but there was an underlying impatience in their gestures. Without warning, the second alien spoke again, its words sharp like a blade and cold as ice. Their message was clear. They were displeased with his presence here and planned to take him to someone more important, someone who would decide his fate. The first alien responded with what seemed to be an agreeing gesture, but Ethan could see the flicker of hesitation in its eyes. Something was off. They were not entirely sure what to make of him, perhaps because he was human, or maybe because of something deeper that they couldn't place. Ethan was taken from his cell and led through narrow metallic corridors, each one filled with strange alien symbols that seemed to pulse with energy. The walls felt alive, as if the ship itself was aware of his presence. He didn't know where they were taking him, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The alien ship was silent except for the echo of their footsteps and the occasional murmur of the voices in his mind. He couldn't help but think of Earth, the quiet nights in his backyard, the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. He longed for those moments, now feeling the weight of isolation crush his chest. The aliens stopped at a large chamber. A massive door slid open, revealing a room that felt more like a throne room than anything else. At the center of the room sat a figure draped in regal attire. Her skin was an unnatural shade of violet, and her eyes glowed a soft blue. She radiated power and elegance, but there was something unsettling about the way she watched him, as if she was not merely observing him but studying him. The first alien bowed deeply to her, while the second remained standing near the door. The Empress watched Ethan with an unreadable expression. Her eyes narrowed as she spoke words that Ethan could not only understand, but also feel in his bones. The power in her voice was undeniable as she addressed him, as if he were nothing more than a curiosity, a prize to be displayed. Ethan swallowed his fear and stood tall. He would not let them see his panic. Not now, not when he had the power to understand their language. He forced himself to keep his composure and nodded slightly as she spoke again, her voice filling the room with a cold certainty she was claiming him as her possession, and he had no idea how he would ever escape this nightmare. Ethan stood motionless in the center of the throne room, his mind racing as the Empress's eyes bore into him, her gaze calculating and cold. She regarded him as if he was some rare animal in a cage to be studied and admired, but he could feel the tension in the air, the weight of her attention pressing down on him like a vice. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, felt deliberate and powerful, yet Ethan could sense a vulnerability underneath her regal composure, a crack in her ironclad facade. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face, as her voice echoed through the chamber, and despite the alien rhythm and cadence of her speech, Ethan understood every word she said. The Empress spoke with authority and curiosity, her tone a mixture of command and intrigue. But beneath that he also heard something darker, a hint of menace, like a predator toying with its prey. Her words were clear. She had claimed him as a pet, a rare treasure of sorts to be displayed at her leisure. Ethan's stomach churned at the idea of being treated like an object to be paraded around for her amusement. He clenched his fists in defiance, but outwardly he remained still. He knew he couldn't let her see his anger. It was too dangerous. Instead, he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. The last thing he needed was to show weakness. He needed to play along for now, bide his time, and wait for the right moment to strike. The Empress motioned to her attendants, and they began to unshackle his chains, her eyes lingering on him with a sense of satisfaction, as if this simple act of freeing him somehow gave her control over him. Ethan didn't move. He let them remove the chains, slowly taking in every detail of the palace around him. The walls were adorned with strange artwork that seemed to move and shift, as though alive. The air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar spices and the hum of alien machinery that seemed to pulse with energy. He'd realized that he was deep inside an empire far beyond anything he could have imagined. As the chains fell away, the Empress stood from her throne and approached him with measured steps. She was tall and imposing, her presence filling the room like a storm ready to strike, yet there was something oddly graceful about her movements as she circled him, inspecting him, as though she were appraising an object of immense value. Her eyes lingered on his face, then moved to his hands and legs, as if taking note of his every feature. Ethan resisted the urge to recoil. He knew better than to show fear. She spoke again, her voice softer now, almost a purr, as she addressed him with a casual familiarity that sent a chill through his bones. She called him her pet in a way that made his skin crawl. Her words were sweet honey dripping from her lips, but the meaning behind them was clear. She viewed him as nothing more than a possession, an ornament to be admired, and perhaps even loved in her own twisted way. Ethan fought the urge to snap back, to challenge her, to tell her that he was more than a prize to be put on display, but he knew that would be foolish. Any show of defiance now could be his last. The Empress smiled as though she could read his thoughts, and for a moment Ethan felt a flicker of unease deep in his chest. She was playing a game, a dangerous one, and he was trapped in it. No matter how much he understood her language, no matter how much he could manipulate the situation, he knew he was out of his depth. This was not just about escaping this alien ship anymore. It was about surviving the schemes of a ruler who had everything at her disposal and nothing to lose. She gestured toward a luxurious couch in the corner of the room and ordered one of her attendants to bring him food and drink. The act felt so patronizing, so utterly degrading, that Ethan could barely contain his disgust. But he knew better than to refuse. He sat down as instructed and accepted the food, though every bite felt like a betrayal to everything he stood for. The Empress didn't sit. She paced around the room, her long violet gown trailing behind her, as she continued to speak of her empire, of the wars she had won, and the enemy she had crushed. The way she spoke of it all with such pride and arrogance made Ethan's blood boil, but he kept his mouth shut. The words came easier now that he understood her, and while his heart screamed to fight back, his mind whispered of caution. The time to act was not yet. As she spoke, Ethan noticed something strange in her behavior. Her words seemed less focused, more disjointed, as though she was distracted by something or perhaps even conflicted. The Empress was not just the cold, calculating ruler she appeared to be. There was something more to her, something he could exploit. but he wasn't sure what it was yet. He would have to wait and observe. And so Ethan waited, listening carefully to every word, every conversation, trying to find the crack in her armor, the weakness he could use to escape, or better yet, to turn the tables in his favor, knowing that his understanding of their language gave him a unique advantage over her, something she had no idea was there. Days passed in a blur of alien rituals and customs that Ethan was forced to endure his mind, constantly working, trying to figure out the best course of action. Every interaction with the Empress was a game, a delicate dance, where he had to remain composed, his understanding of her language now giving him an edge he hadn't anticipated. She spoke to him, often with a strange kindness, a mix of curiosity and ownership, as though he were both an enigma and a toy to be played with. He could sense the power she held in every glance and every word, but he also sensed something else, something deeper, a vulnerability lurking just beneath the surface. The Empress was not as invincible as she appeared, and as time wore on, Ethan began to see the cracks in her facade, small things that others might overlook, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes when she spoke of her empire's future, the way she hesitated when discussing her inner circle, the advisors who surrounded her, and the subtle power struggles that simmered beneath the surface. The Empress trusted no one completely, not even herself, and that was where Ethan saw his opportunity. Her advisors were an ever-present part of her life. They were the ones who helped maintain the power she held over the galaxy, yet they were also the ones who whispered behind her back, scheming for their own agendas. Ethan could hear it in the way they spoke, the coded language of ambition and betrayal that filled the palace corridors, their voices dripping with veiled threats and promises of power for those who were willing to rise up and take it. Ethan had learned much in these past few days. He had overheard enough to know that the Empress's reign was far from secure. There were factions within her court who would be more than happy to see her dethroned and replaced by someone else, someone weaker, perhaps someone more easily controlled. The more he listened, the more he realized that he was not the only one playing a dangerous game here. Everyone on this ship was vying for control, and the Empress was blissfully unaware of how precariously her empire balanced on the edge of a knife. One evening, as the Empress held a lavish dinner to celebrate her latest conquest, Ethan overheard a conversation between two of her most trusted advisors. Their words came to him like a flood of information, a web of manipulation and deceit. They were planning a coup. They spoke of undermining the Empress's authority, planting doubts in her mind, and slowly turning her allies against her. As he listened, Ethan's heart raced. He now knew the full extent of the danger around him, but also the leverage it provided him. The realization hit him hard. The stakes had just been raised. He was no longer simply a captive in this alien world. He was now a player in a deadly game for power and survival. He knew that he had to act quickly before the coup could gain momentum, before the conspirators could put their plans into motion. But he also knew that if he moved too rashly, he would be discovered and disposed of without hesitation. Ethan began to carefully maneuver through the palace as if he were just another obedient pet, his every action calculated, his every word chosen with care. He began to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those who still supported the Empress. He spread rumors of corruption and incompetence among her advisors, speaking in hushed tones to those he could trust to listen carefully, feeding them just enough to set their minds in motion, but never enough to fully expose his hand. All the while he maintained his position by the Empress's side, pretending to be nothing more than the quiet captive. But as he played his part, he also grew more aware of the danger he was in. The longer he stayed, the more likely it was that someone would figure out that he was not as helpless as he appeared. The more he engaged with the undercurrents of power and manipulation, the more he realized how easily he could become a pawn in this game. But for now he had to keep playing the game, waiting for the right moment to strike, knowing that in a world where betrayal was commonplace, he would have to be just as cunning as the ones around him if he was going to survive and escape. Ethan's strategy had become a delicate balancing act, his every move calculated, his every word crafted with precision. He spent his days observing the palace's inner workings, the whispered conversations of the servants, the quiet murmurs of discontent among the higher-ranking officials, and the growing tension between the Empress and her advisors, he had begun to understand the political web surrounding Valera the Empress, her loyalty to her advisors, her delicate need to maintain control. All of it could be used against her, but to do so, Ethan would need to be patient and wait for the right moment to strike. He spent more time with the Empress feigning obedience, offering her small tokens of affection, when he could just enough to remain in her favor, just enough to remain useful to her. She seemed to appreciate the attention, and occasionally even opened up to him about her own struggles, the wars she had fought, the enemies she had crushed, the loneliness of her position, her isolation at the top of an empire that she herself feared might crumble beneath her feet. It was in these quiet moments that Ethan saw the cracks in her personality, the vulnerability beneath the power, and as much as he despised what she had done to his world, he couldn't help but pity her. Yet every time he felt a flicker of sympathy, he reminded himself of his true purpose. He was no longer a prisoner, but a player in a larger game, and if he was going to escape this place and ensure the safety of his people, he would need to outwit everyone, even the Empress. One evening, as he sat in the corner of the lavish dining hall, his eyes scanned the room, picking out every detail, every movement around him. He had already memorized the layout of the palace, the guards' patrol routes, the way the advisors subtly communicated with one another. He was ready to act when the time was right. Across the room, Valera sat at the head of the table, her regal posture commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Her advisors flanked her on either side, their eyes wary and calculating. Ethan could see the tension in the room. It was palpable. The advisors were becoming more vocal in their dissent, their whispers louder and more frequent, their displeasure with Valera's leadership becoming harder to hide from those around them. Ethan had to act quickly. The window of opportunity was closing. He leaned back in his seat, pretending to be uninterested in the conversation that surrounded him, his mind calculating every possibility, considering every move he could make. And then he saw at the smallest opening the briefest flicker of doubt in the eyes of one of Valera's most trusted advisors, an older alien with a sharp nose and piercing black eyes. His name was Drax, and Ethan knew he was a key player in the conspiracy to overthrow the Empress. Drax had been quietly gathering support from the other advisors and discontented factions within the Empire for weeks now. He had even begun spreading rumors of Valera's weakness. Ethan saw an opportunity to strike. Drax was too confident, too careless in his movements, and Ethan knew that with the right push, he could turn him against Valera, or better yet, cause a rift between Drax and the other conspirators before their plan could come to fruition. He stood slowly, making his way toward the corner of the room where Drax was engaged in conversation with another advisor. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he moved with deliberate ease. He had to be careful. Every action had to be perfect. One misstep, and it could all be over. As he approached Drax, he allowed a faint smirk to cross his face. His body language relaxed, his eyes glinting with quiet malice. Drax looked up, startled, as Ethan leaned in close enough to whisper in his ear. The words he spoke were simple yet powerful enough to plant the seed of distrust in Drax's mind. Just a few carefully chosen words, and Drax's expression shifted subtly. His shoulders tensed, his gaze flickering toward Valera, before returning to Ethan with a look of confusion and suspicion. The seed had been planted now. It was up to Ethan to watch as the conspiracy unfolded, knowing that the Empress's hold on her empire was slipping, and in the chaos that would follow, he would be ready to make his next move. The days following the conversation with Drax passed in a tense silence, a quiet storm building in the palace. Ethan could feel it in the air, the subtle shift in the way the advisors interacted with each other, the way Valera's attention began to waver. She no longer held the same confidence she once did. Her posture slumped slightly, and her eyes became more guarded, as if she were constantly watching over her shoulder for the next betrayal. It wasn't just the advisors who were watching her now. It was everyone. Even the servants and guards spoke in hushed tones behind her back. The once perfect empire was beginning to show signs of decay, and Ethan could see it all unfold with every passing day. He kept his role as the Empress's pet, well-rehearsed, obedient, and submissive, always at her side, always offering her the adoration she sought, but inside his mind, churned with plans and possibilities, his goal was clear. He needed to use the growing unrest to his advantage, to weaken Valera's position, until she was vulnerable enough to be overthrown, and with Drax now harboring doubt about his place in the conspiracy, the chance for that to happen had never been closer. As the Empress's trust in her inner circle began to fray, Ethan noticed her turning to him, more often seeking his presence as a source of comfort. She shared more of her personal thoughts with him, the weight of her responsibilities, and the fear that gnawed at her every waking moment. She spoke of her desire for peace, and how she feared that her empire was crumbling beneath her feet. She spoke of her ambition to build something lasting, to prove to herself and the galaxy that she could rule with strength. But there was something hollow in her words, as if even she doubted her own ability to hold onto the power she had so ruthlessly claimed. Ethan listened to her every word as if it were a key unlocking the deepest parts of her mind. He understood now that her power was built on fragile foundations, and that she was no different from any other ruler, afraid of losing control, afraid of being replaced. He had to be careful not to allow any hints of his true intentions to surface. He couldn't let her know that he was playing her game just as much as she was playing his. One evening, Valera took him aside to a secluded part of the palace. She seemed distant, her eyes searching the room, as though expecting to see an enemy hiding in every shadow. She pulled him close, her voice low and trembling as she confessed her fears, her voice laced with an edge of desperation and vulnerability. She spoke of the whispers among her advisors, the growing discontent, the rumors of her inability to control the galaxy she ruled. Ethan's mind raced as she spoke. Every word was an opening, a crack in her armor. She was desperate, she was afraid. And it was in these moments that he saw the opportunity to strike. He knew that if he played his cards right, he could manipulate her fears to further destabilize her hold on the Empire. He spoke softly to her, his voice calm and reassuring, as he planted ideas in her mind, whispers of loyalty, that she could trust only in herself. He told her that her power was too great to be taken from her, that the Empire was hers and hers alone, and that the advisors around her were only waiting for the right moment to strike at her weakness. She looked at him with wide eyes, as if seeing him in a new light. Her trust in him grew stronger, and with it the bond between them deepened. She clung to his words, as though they were the only thing holding her together, and in that moment Ethan knew he had her exactly where he wanted her. The final pieces of his plan were falling into place as he continued to manipulate the subtle rifts between her and her advisors. The tension continued to build like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Soon the time would come to make his move, to tip the balance of power in his favor, and to escape from the clutches of the Empress once and for all. But for now he had to remain patient, to keep playing the part of the loyal pet until the moment was right to strike. And when that moment came, he would be ready to seize control of his destiny. Ethan spent his days in quiet observation, carefully watching the subtle interactions between Valera and her advisors. He could sense the growing unease among the Empress's inner circle. They were becoming more open in their discontent, their glances more pointed, and their conversations more frequent as they plotted behind her back. Each move they made seemed to tighten the noose around her neck, and Ethan was ready to use their discontent to his advantage. The Empress continued to confide in him, her fears and doubts growing more apparent with each passing day. She clung to him like a lifeline, seeking comfort in his presence, as though he were the only one who understood her struggles, her isolation at the top of her empire, the loneliness that gnawed at her despite the vast power she wielded. She often spoke of her dreams of conquering more worlds, expanding her reign to every corner of the galaxy. But Ethan could see the cracks in her resolve. She no longer had the same fire in her eyes that she once did. The weight of her own ambitions was starting to crush her, and it wouldn't be long before her empire began to crumble under the strain. Ethan could feel the tension rising around him, the air heavy with the pressure of impending betrayal, as the conspiracy to overthrow Valera grew more dangerous. By the day, he had planted the seeds of doubt in Drax's mind, and now it seemed the advisor was growing restless, his movements more erratic, his glances more furtive, as if he were waiting for the right moment to act. It was a risky play, but one that would pay off if Ethan could push Drax to make a mistake that would unravel the entire plot. The palace had become a ticking time bomb, and Ethan could feel it every time he walked through its halls. The whispers of power struggles were now too loud to ignore, and he knew it was only a matter of time before everything would explode. The question was, when would the first spark ignite, and who would be left standing when the dust settled? One evening, Valeria invited him to a private dinner in her chambers. The atmosphere was tense, the tension between them palpable. She had grown more distant in recent days, her eyes shadowed with doubt as she prepared for the worst, yet still clung to her belief that she could control the situation. She spoke of how she had trusted those around her, how she had brought them into her fold, and how they had betrayed her trust. As she ranted, Ethan remained silent, his eyes never leaving her face, studying her every movement and expression. It was then that he saw, at the moment of weakness, a flicker of fear in her eyes as she spoke of Drax, the advisor she had once relied on so heavily, but now doubted. The weight of his loyalty had become questionable, and Ethan knew it was time to push further. He had to ensure that Drax's betrayal would be the catalyst for the destruction of Valera's reign. He leaned in slightly, his voice soft, but filled with intent as he spoke. His words aimed to plant the idea of Drax's betrayal deeper into her mind. Her eyes widened for a moment, before narrowing as suspicion grew behind her gaze. She had always been aware of the cracks forming around her, but now they were becoming impossible to ignore. The seeds Ethan had planted were now taking root, and he could see the change in her, the way her eyes shifted when Drax's name was mentioned, the way her hand tightened around her glass of wine, as if to steady herself against the flood of doubt rushing through her mind. It was a small shift, but one that signaled a change in the power dynamics within the palace. As Valera turned her attention to the distant views of the stars outside the window, Ethan knew he had one final opportunity to push her further into isolation and distrust. The more she turned inward, the more her advisors would sense the shift, and the more likely they would act. Ethan could feel the tension thickening in the air. A storm was coming, and it was only a matter of time before the palace was torn apart by the very people who had once supported her. But as Ethan watched her gaze linger on the stars, a thought crossed his mind. He could feel the pull of something bigger than himself now. This was no longer just about survival or escape. This was about taking control of the future and seizing the power that had been denied to him. For so long, the Empress might have been the one who ruled the galaxy, but he had the power to change everything. The days began to blend together for Ethan, the tension in the palace growing with each passing moment. Every word, every glance from Valera was now weighted with the fear of what was to come. The once unwavering confidence in her reign was beginning to crumble, and Ethan could feel the shift in the air. He had played his part well, carefully maneuvering between the factions within the palace, planting seeds of doubt and watching as the conspiracy to dethrone Valera slowly gained momentum. He knew the time was nearing, but he also understood that one wrong move could destroy everything. He spent his time in her presence, pretending to be the docile, obedient pet that she wanted him to be, but in his mind, he was always calculating, always thinking of the next move. The growing distrust between Valera and her advisors was becoming more apparent. The fractures in her empire were deepening, and Ethan had to ensure that when the moment came, he would be in the right position to strike. The only question was, when would the final spark come, and who would light the match? It was during a late-night meeting that Ethan finally got the answer to that question. Valera had summoned him to her chambers. Once again, the palace was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the artificial lights and the distant murmur of conversation in the halls outside her chamber. She looked tired, more so than usual, her regal posture faltering slightly as she spoke of the growing threat from her advisors. She had become obsessed with the idea that they were all conspiring against her, and Ethan could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that he hadn't seen before. It was as if she could no longer tell who was truly loyal to her and who was simply waiting for the right moment to turn on her. She spoke of Drax, the advisor who had once been her closest confidant, the one who had helped her build the empire that now threatened to destroy her. She spoke of how he had changed in recent days, how he had grown more distant, and how his actions seemed to betray the loyalty he had once sworn to her. Ethan knew that the Empress was on the verge of breaking, and he knew that he had to push her further into that madness if he was going to have a chance at achieving his goal. He approached her slowly, careful not to betray the calm exterior he had cultivated for so long, and in that moment he made his move. He spoke softly to her, his voice low and soothing, as he mentioned Drax once again. This time he hinted at the possibility that Drax might be planning something far worse than mere betrayal. He planted the idea in her mind that Drax could be plotting against her on a scale she had never imagined, and that it was only a matter of time before he made his move. The Empress's eyes widened, her breath quickened. As the idea began to take root, her gaze flickered with suspicion, and Ethan could see the storm brewing behind her eyes, the uncertainty, the fear. It was all there, and he knew that now was the time to strike. The conspiracy within her court had reached a boiling point, and the moment Drax made a move, Valeria would be forced to confront the truth of her own downfall. Ethan could feel the pressure building within him, too. The web of manipulation he had woven was now taut, ready to snap, and he knew that when it did, it would not only change the course of the Empress's future, but his own. He was no longer just a player in this game. He was now the one pulling the strings, guiding the Empire toward its inevitable collapse. But what came after that would be the real test. The power vacuum that would follow could mean everything or nothing, depending on who emerged as the victor, and Ethan knew he would have to be ready to claim that power if he was to truly escape this alien nightmare. As Valeria's mind swirled with the implications of his words, she rose from her chair abruptly, her eyes wild with the fear of betrayal that now consumed her. She began pacing the room, the weight of the Empire pressing down on her shoulders as she struggled to maintain control. Ethan watched her silently as the tension reached its peak. He had pushed her to the edge now. It was up to the others to act, to seal her fate and his own. The final act was set in motion, and Ethan knew that whatever came next would determine the future of the galaxy and his place within it. The days following that tense conversation with Valeria were nothing short of chaotic. The atmosphere in the palace was thick with suspicion. Every advisor and servant seemed to be walking on eggshells, as if they could sense the storm that was brewing. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The game was now more dangerous than ever, and there was no turning back. Valeria had become a ticking time bomb, her fear and paranoia growing with every passing moment, and the rift between her and her advisors had widened to a point where it was only a matter of time before someone made a move. Ethan kept his role as the loyal pet, the silent observer. He had played this part so well that no one suspected the true depth of his involvement in the chaos unfolding around them. Valeria had become more withdrawn. She no longer sought his company as frequently, and when she did, it was out of desperation. Her once sharp eyes now clouded with doubt and fear. She was no longer the powerful Empress she had been just days ago. Instead, she was a woman on the verge of losing everything: her empire, her power, and even her sanity. As Valeria grew more unstable, the advisors became more bold. They began making their moves in the shadows, whispering amongst themselves of the coup. They were planning to finally rid themselves of her once and for all. Ethan had been expecting this, but the speed at which it was happening took him by surprise. It seemed that the moment Valeria's grip on the Empire had weakened enough, the conspirators were ready to strike. It was Drax who made the first move. He was the one who approached Valeria one evening in the grand hall of the palace. Under the guise of loyalty and concern, he spoke of the growing unrest within the Empire, the discontent among the people, the rising power of the rebel factions. He presented himself as a true ally, offering solutions to the problems that were threatening to tear the Empire apart. But Ethan saw through his charade. He knew Drax was only pretending to be the savior, when in reality, he was the one plotting Valeria's downfall. Ethan watched the conversation unfold from the shadows of the hall, his heart pounding in his chest. He could sense the tension between Drax and the Empress. It was thick with lies and manipulation, but Valeria seemed to be buying into it. Her desperation for an answer was palpable. She grasped at Drax's words as if they were the only lifeline left for her to hold on to. Drax spoke of an alliance with the neighboring empire, promising Valeria that together they could crush the rebellion and restore order to the galaxy. He painted a picture of power and victory, but Ethan could see the truth beneath the surface. Drax wasn't offering her help, he was offering her a way to step aside, and allow him to take control. The quiet rebellion against her had reached its tipping point, and now the conspirators were making their move. It was then that Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't just sit by and let the palace collapse around him. He had spent too much time playing the part of the obedient pet, too much time allowing the Empress to believe that she was the one in control. He had to act before Drax could take full control of the situation, before Valeera's reign came to an end. With calculated precision, Ethan approached the scene, drawing closer to the Empress and her betrayer. He had to be careful. This moment would determine everything for him. If he failed now, there would be no second chances. Valeera would fall, and so would he. But if he succeeded, he would be the one to rise from the ashes of her empire and take control of the future that lay ahead. As he neared the Empress and Drax, he made his move, a subtle shift in his body language enough to draw Drax's attention away from Valeera. For just a moment, Ethan's eyes locked onto Drax's. In that brief exchange, there was a flash of recognition, the briefest flicker of doubt, and it was all Ethan needed in that instant. He whispered just loud enough for Drax to hear, "You're making a mistake." And then he retreated back into the shadows, his words carrying more weight than any sword or weapon could have. Drax faltered for just a moment, his eyes narrowing, as if trying to process what had just happened. Valeera didn't notice. She was too consumed by the conversation unfolding in front of her. But that one moment of hesitation had set something in motion. Ethan could feel the balance of power shift. The game was far from over, but he had just tipped the scales in his favor. Now, it was time to watch as the conspirators turned on each other and the Empress's empire began to unravel at the seams. The palace was in turmoil. The whispers of betrayal were no longer subtle but deafening. Every step Ethan took was now fraught with the knowledge that the endgame was near, and the pieces were falling into place around him. With each passing hour, he could feel the intensity building as the conspirators closed in on each other. Drax had hesitated just long enough for doubt to take root, and now the tension in the air was palpable. There were cracks forming everywhere, and Ethan was prepared to take full advantage of them. Valeera continued to struggle with her position, her eyes darting nervously around the palace, as if expecting a dagger to come at her from every corner. She had retreated deeper into herself, unable to trust anyone. Her isolation had become her prison, and the more she closed herself off, the easier it became for those around her to manipulate her. Her advisors grew bolder. They sensed the weakening of her resolve, and they knew that if they didn't act quickly, their chance at seizing power would slip away. Drax was no longer the only threat. He had become paranoid and increasingly erratic as Ethan's words took root in his mind. The cracks in his loyalty to the Empress had deepened, and the other conspirators began to smell blood. They saw his hesitation as an opening, and now they were preparing to move in for the kill. Ethan knew that Drax was no longer the mastermind behind the coup, but a pawn in the hands of others. His hesitation had doomed him to become expendable in the eyes of those who had been waiting for their moment. Ethan's thoughts turned to the final steps of his plan. He had played his part in setting the pieces in motion, but now it was time for him to take control. It was time to put an end to the power struggle and seize the opportunity that had presented itself so perfectly in the chaos he had orchestrated. He had known from the beginning that the key to his escape and survival was not just manipulating the Empress, but understanding the people around her, their weaknesses and desires, the very things that made them human or alien. As the case may be, Ethan had learned to play the part of the loyal pet, but now he was ready to cast off that role and become the true master of his fate. That night, Valeera summoned him once again, her face drawn and weary, as she spoke of the unrest within the palace, of the growing threats to her rule. She had no one left to trust, and her voice trembled as she confessed her fear of losing everything. Ethan listened with careful detachment, his expression one of concern, but inside his mind was calculating his next move. He knew that this was the moment. The final move had to be played perfectly, and with Drax faltering, he knew the time was now. With deliberate slowness, he approached the Empress, his eyes locked on hers. As he stepped closer, she looked up at him, her gaze searching for reassurance, and for the first time in a long while he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a last vestige of the woman who had once been a conqueror and a ruler, the same woman who had invaded his world and made him her pet, but now she was broken and lost. "Valera," he said her name like a quiet command, and she looked at him expectantly. "You don't have to do this, you don't have to lose everything." His voice was calm, steady, and he could see the way she clung to his words, her desperation, leading her to trust him in ways she hadn't before. Ethan took another step closer to her, his hand gently brushing against her cheek, the touch gentle enough to be mistaken for affection. But his mind was already working faster than ever. He knew that if he moved just right, if he played his cards correctly, he could not only escape this palace, but take control of it all. He could seize the power that had eluded him for so long. In that moment, he understood what he had to do with Drax and the other conspirators already at each other's throats, and Valera's reign crumbling from within. Ethan saw a single path forward, to step into the void that was left behind by the collapse of the Empress's rule, to become the one who would claim the throne not just for himself, but for the future of the galaxy, to show them all that the Empress's pet had become something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. He whispered softly, "It's not too late for you, Valera, but it's too late for your empire." And with those words, the final chapter began to unfold. Ethan wasn't the pet any longer. He was the master of his fate, and the ruler of the galaxy that would soon be his.